Today, we're jumping into a part of the Old Testament that honestly gets overlooked a lot. We're talking about the prophets who weren't just speaking to Israel, but to the world.
So when you think about the Hebrew prophets, guys like Isaiah or Jeremiah, you probably imagine them speaking to their own people, to Israel and Judah. And look, that's absolutely true, but it's only half the picture. The real question is, who else were they talking to?
Because the answer to that question unpacks something massive. It shows us that the God of Israel was never meant to be some local, tribal God. The vision from the very beginning was always global.
All right, let's get into this. The whole idea here is that God's message wasn't just for one nation, it was for everybody. It was a message for the world.
And you know what? This wasn't some new idea that came along later. Nope. This goes all the way back to the promise God made to Abraham, right at the beginning of Israel's story. The plan was global from day one. Israel was chosen to be a vehicle, a channel for God's blessing to flow out to all the nations.
To really get how wild this was, you have to picture the ancient world. Most cultures believed in what we'd call territorial gods. Your God's power stopped at the river or at the edge of your kingdom. So when the God of Israel starts sending prophets to other nations, it's a revolutionary statement. It's basically saying, hey, I'm not stuck on one mountain. I'm the God of all history, and every single nation answers to me. So how did this actually work? Well, it mainly happened in two ways. Sometimes a prophet was literally sent to a foreign nation, kind of like an ambassador with a message from the king of the universe. But way more often, a prophet in Israel would speak about another nation, declaring God's judgment for everyone to hear. Now keep that framework in mind, sent to versus speaking about, because it's going to be really important. Okay, let's look at a case study, and it's probably the most famous one, Nineveh. This was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the most brutal and feared empires of the ancient world. And it's a story we see through the eyes of two totally different prophets. First up, you've got Jonah. God tells him to go to Nineveh, the heart of the enemy's empire, and he's like, no thanks. He literally runs in the opposite direction. And why? It's not because he was scared of them. It was because he was scared they might actually repent and God might forgive them. So after a little detour involving a giant fish, he finally goes. He stomps into this massive city, mumbles a 5-word sermon in Hebrew, and the impossible happens. The entire city, from the king on down, repents. It's shocking. And Jonah is furious. He can't believe God would show mercy to Israel's worst enemies. The entire book ends with God asking him this question, while Jonah is just sitting there pouting. The question just hangs in the air, forcing us, the readers, to deal with this uncomfortable, almost scandalous idea that God's compassion extends even to our enemies. Now, you might think, okay, great, Nineveh repented, story's over, happy ending, but that wasn't the end of the story. History is never quite that neat. See, more than 100 years passed. That whole generation that repented was gone, and Assyria went right back to its old ways. Violence, oppression, total arrogance. So God sent another prophet. His name was Nahum. And this time, the message was completely different. Put them together, and these two prophets are like two sides of the same coin. Jonah's story shows that God's mercy is real, and it's offered to everyone, even the absolute worst of us. But Nahum's message shows that God's justice is also real, and it's final when that mercy is rejected over and over again. The mercy shown to Nineveh delayed their judgment, but it didn't cancel. Now, the prophets didn't just speak to faraway, big bad empires. They also had a lot to say about betrayals that were much, much closer to home. And that brings us to the nation of Edom. So the Edomites, they were related to Israel, descendants of Esau, Jacob's twin brother. They were literally family. But when the Babylonian army destroyed Jerusalem, what did Edom do? They didn't just stand by and watch. They cheered. They joined in the looting. They even captured Jewish refugees who were trying to escape and handed them back to the enemy. The prophet Obadiah's message isn't just about violence. It's about the deep, terrible pain of being betrayed by our own kin. And this is where we see a really key prophetic principle, moral symmetry. Obadiah basically says, you reap what you sow. What you've done to others will be done back to you. God holds nations accountable. And being family doesn't get you a pass. In fact, it makes the crime even worse. So from this very specific judgment on a neighboring country, the prophet Joel just pulls the camera way, way back. He starts talking about a day of the Lord. But this isn't just for Edom or Babylon. It's a moment of cosmic reckoning for all the nations. The scale suddenly explodes from regional
to global. So we've seen mercy for an enemy, and we've seen justice for a traitor. But what's the end game here? Is it all just about God punishing the bad guys? Well, the prophets point to something way more surprising, way more hopeful. Fast forward a bit. The people of Israel have been through the trauma of exile and are back in the land. And a prophet named Zechariah gives this incredible vision of the future. He's asking the big question, what is the ultimate purpose for all these nations in God's story? And here is the absolutely revolutionary answer. The goal isn't the destruction of the nations. It's their invitation. It's that they would willingly join with God. They're not just objects of judgment anymore. They are now potential partners in a restored world. They're invited to the party. So how on earth does that happen? Not the way empires usually do things, right? Not with swords and conquest. Zechariah sees a new kind of king coming. Not a warrior on a war horse, but a humble king riding on a donkey, bringing peace. The nations are drawn in, not by force, but by a completely different kind of power. Okay, so we've gone from Jonah's reluctance to Nahum's judgment to Zechariah's hope. What's the one big message we can pull from all of this? Let's try to tie it all together.
I think it stands on four main pillars. First, God is sovereign over all history, not just Israel's. Second, God's justice is universal. No nation gets away with violence and pride forever. Third, God's mercy is wider than we could ever imagine, reaching even to the people we think are our worst enemies. And finally, the ultimate goal isn't to destroy nations, but to invite them into alignment with God's peaceful kingdom.
To put it as plainly as possible, the prophets to the nations are making this incredibly bold claim. The God of Israel isn't just for Israel. He is the judge of all peoples, the ultimate enemy of human violence, and the one true source of mercy for the entire world.
And that leaves us with one last question to think about. In a world that's still all about the rise and fall of powers and empires, if these prophets are right, if arrogant power always crumbles in the end, but the offer of mercy somehow endures, what does that tell us about where real, lasting power is actually found?